What these officers didn't know was that this woman held the power to dismantle their careers with a single word. This is the story of justice served ice cold. Hey, story lovers, welcome to Narratives by Dan, where real-life drama meets jaw-dropping twists. Smash that subscribe button and join the 100K plus squad who live for justice, truth, and stories that'll leave you speechless. Let's dive in. They thought they were beyond reach, untouchable in their power, until the woman they arrested proved them wrong. The low hum of Valerie's sleek sedan cut through the stillness of the Anaheim Hills suburbs, where the quiet had a way of masking the chaos lurking beneath the surface. Judge Valerie Chambers, a pillar of the legal system for over 20 years, drove in solitude, her thoughts tangled in the echoes of the courtroom. Each night this drive became her unwritten ritual, a moment to dissect the battles fought, the verdicts delivered, and the justice still left undone. Weighing the complexities of a high-profile case, her mind remained sharp, her judgment unwavering. But tonight, fatigue settled deep in her bones, pressing down like an unseen weight. Her thoughts drifted. Her daughter's graduation was just around the corner, and she still hadn't written her speech. She had promised herself a break once this trial was over, a rare moment to breathe. Amid the relentless pace of her career, life was chaotic but fulfilling. Then, in an instant, the night shifted. Red and blue lights flared in her rearview mirror, slicing through the darkness. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she eased onto the shoulder. Confusion flickered through her. She wasn't speeding, hadn't missed a light. As the patrol car rolled to a stop behind her, she instinctively reached for her purse, where her driver's license and registration sat neatly tucked away, right where she always kept them. The flashing red and blue lights painted restless streaks across her dashboard as two officers emerged from the patrol car, their presence heavy in the still night air. A sharp rap on the driver's side window made her flinch, more forceful than necessary. "Evening, ma'am. License and registration?" the taller officer demanded, his voice clipped and devoid of politeness. Without hesitation, Valerie handed over the documents, keeping her expression calm. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The second officer leaned in, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, sweeping methodically across the interior of her car. "We ask the questions," he muttered, his tone carrying an unspoken warning. The officer muttered something under his breath, but Valerie didn't take the bait. Her professional instincts kicked in. Stay calm, don't escalate, keep control of the moment. "Of course, officers," she replied evenly, keeping her voice steady. But the tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken intent. What began as routine questioning quickly unraveled into something else. Questions turned into accusations. Accusations twisted into thinly veiled threats. She tried to explain who she was, why she was on the road at this hour, the very nature of her career in upholding the law, but it didn't matter. They weren't listening. To them, she wasn't a judge. She wasn't a woman with decades of experience in the legal system. She was just another driver to intimidate, another person to remind who held the power. Something felt off. Valerie couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but the unease settled deep in her gut. Still, she remained composed, knowing instinctively that this was only the beginning. The taller officer, Reynolds, according to his name tag, stepped back, flipping through her documents with exaggerated slowness. It wasn't efficiency, it was theater, a calculated display of control. His partner, a stocky, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, Officer Daniels, hovered closer, his flashlight now fixed directly on her face. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here so late?" Daniels asked, his tone teetering on the edge of something unspoken, something just shy of outright hostility. Daniels' words dripped with condescension, each syllable a subtle jab that settled under Valerie's skin like an unwelcome splinter. She drew in a slow, measured breath, carefully constructing her response. "I'm heading home. I had a late night at work," she said, her voice controlled, offering nothing beyond the simple truth. Reynolds barely looked up from her license, his smirk stretching into something almost amused. "Late night, huh? What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a judge," she answered, holding his gaze with quiet certainty. It wasn't a boast, just a fact. But instead of acknowledgement, her words were met with disbelief. Daniels let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if she'd just claimed to be an astronaut. "A judge? That's a new one." A knot tightened in Valerie's stomach. She had witnessed this before. Not directed at her, but at others. The subtle erosion of dignity, the way skepticism draped itself in the guise of routine questioning. A slow, deliberate stripping of authority, as if the very idea of her position was somehow up for debate. It was all too familiar. The tone, the doubt, the quiet power play unfolding before her. Valerie kept her expression neutral, though her heart had begun to race. Reynolds leaned in slightly, his smirk widening like a wolf toying with its prey. "You got any proof of that, Judge? Or should we skip the formalities and get to the part where you tell us what you're really up to?" Valerie met his gaze, her voice steady, controlled. "Proof," she echoed. "Officers, I've complied with everything you've asked. I've provided my license and registration. If there's an issue, I'd like to address it." Reynolds didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned, handing her documents off to Daniels, a silent exchange that made Valerie's pulse quicken. Then, with a flick of his hand, he motioned toward the patrol car, toward the back of the car. "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds ordered. For a moment, Valerie considered refusing. She knew her rights, knew they had no valid reason to take this any further. But she also knew the risk of standing her ground. A wrong move, a slight miscalculation, and this could spiral into something far worse. With a composed sigh, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out into the cool night air. Daniels moved in, closer than necessary, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, a silent warning. "Turn around," he ordered. Valerie blinked, disbelief flickering across her face. "Excuse me?" "Turn around, hands behind your back." She hesitated. "Are you detaining me?" Her voice remained steady, but a thin thread of tension wove its way through her words. The weight of the moment pressed down on Valerie, each second thick with the sting of injustice. Her mind raced, trying to grasp for any logical reason that could make sense of this. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice steady but the rising panic just beneath the surface. Reynolds shrugged, his smirk now a full-blown grin, as if this were some sick game. "Suspicious behavior," he said, his words dripping with sarcasm. "We'll sort it out at the station." Valerie's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her own ears. Her thoughts scattered, but before she could protest, cold metal clamped around her wrists. The humiliation was raw, visceral. It stung like fire, and her body tensed, as if to fight, but something held her back. She knew, deep down, they didn't care who she was. They weren't interested in the truth, the facts, or the law. They only cared about the narrative they'd already written, one where she was guilty before they even knew her name. As they guided her toward the back of the patrol car, a small crowd began to gather, watching her like she was a spectacle. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the flashing lights and the spectacle unfolding before them. Some peeked through their windows, while others stepped onto their porches to watch. Valerie caught the eye of an older man standing in a robe and slippers, his face a blend of concern and confusion. For a moment their gazes locked, but she didn't dare speak. She didn't dare look away either. She held her ground, silently allowing herself to be placed in the back seat of the patrol car, her head high despite the ache of humiliation that was starting to seep in. The drive to the station was eerily silent, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. Valerie stared out the window, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest like a lead blanket. Every mile felt like a step further from control, further from the woman she knew herself to be. As the patrol car hummed through the streets, Valerie's mind raced with thoughts of her daughter, her colleagues, the countless people who had come to see her as a symbol of justice. How would they react to this? What would this mean for her career, her reputation? The question spiraled, but amidst the flood of emotions, one thought pierced through with clarity. They didn't know who she was. Not yet. The night was far from over, but Valerie's resolve only grew stronger. She couldn't afford to lose this battle, not for herself but for everyone who had ever stood in her shoes, who had ever been silenced, underestimated, or dismissed. This wasn't just about her. It was about proving a point, about standing for something bigger than the injustice of the moment. The holding cell was small and cold, the kind of sterile space that made her skin prickle. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and something stale, something that reminded her she wasn't just another person caught in a misstep. She was being reduced to a mere inconvenience, a statistic. Hands still cuffed, the metal biting into her wrists. A dull ache began to spread, but she refused to let it show. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, her posture rigid, refusing to let the officers see even a hint of discomfort. They had taken her belongings, her phone, her purse, even her watch, and left her in silence, as if hoping the quiet would chip away at her resolve. But Valerie wouldn't let it. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The oppressive stillness of the cell wrapped around her, thickening the air, while her mind raced. Questions, fears, doubts swirled, but above all else, a fierce determination began to take root. She knew she wasn't the first black woman to be treated like this, treated as less, as disposable. But she refused to forget the shock, the heartache, and the loss of her son. The space felt like it leached warmth from her very soul. Valerie sat on the cold bench, her let it end here. She was determined to make sure that her story wouldn't be just another statistic, another forgotten case. She would ensure they'd remember her name. Drawing on every ounce of patience and strength she had cultivated over her years on the bench, Valerie stayed still, her thoughts focused, despite the mounting tension. But suddenly, a commotion broke through her quiet resolve. A door slammed open, followed by a commanding voice that echoed through the station. "What's going on here?" Valerie turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of the man who had just entered. It was Michael Harrington, one of her colleagues. District Attorney Michael Harrington, to be exact. He was a relentless advocate for justice, someone who had worked alongside Valerie on countless cases. His usual calm and collected demeanor was now a mask of barely contained fury, his sharp suit only adding to the sense of authority that radiated from him. Seeing him there brought a spark of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by a surge of anticipation, and she knew Michael, he wouldn't let this slide. "Fury!" he snapped, his voice cutting through the tension, as he spotted Valerie sitting in the cell. "Judge Chambers, what in the world is this?" Reynolds and Daniels immediately stiffened, their earlier bravado evaporating in an instant. They were no longer the ones in control. It's just a routine," Harrington cut him off, his voice sharp and authoritative, like the crack of a whip. "You arrested a sitting judge? On what grounds?" The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Valerie remained seated, her face a mask of composure, betraying none of the emotions churning inside her. Her heart pounded, but she didn't move. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but she knew Harrington could handle this better than anyone. Daniels stammered, his voice trembling slightly. She was acting suspicious." "Suspicious, Harrington's?" Harrington's voice rose, the skepticism clear. "What exactly about a judge going home after a late shift looks suspicious to you?" Harrington repeated the question, his voice dripping with incredulity. "Do you even understand what you've done? Or are you too blinded by your assumptions to see it?" Reynolds stepped forward, his posture trying to reassert control. "We were just doing our job, sir." "Your job?" Harrington snapped, his tone sharp. "Your job is to uphold the law, not violate it." Valerie watched, silently, as the balance of power in the room shifted. For the first time that evening she felt a flicker of hope. Harrington's presence was like a lifeline, a reminder that truth still mattered, that justice could still prevail. But even as her hope stirred, she knew this wasn't over. The battle had only just begun. Wasn't over. not by a long shot. After what felt like an eternity, the officers reluctantly unlocked the cell. The door swung open and Valerie stood, her posture as dignified as ever. She met Harrington's gaze, offering a brief nod of gratitude before turning to face the two officers. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I trust we'll be seeing each other again soon." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She didn't wait for a response, stepping out of the station with her head held high. The humiliation of the evening still clung to her, but so did her resolve. This wasn't just about her. This was about ensuring that the truth couldn't be ignored, about standing tall for anyone who had ever been unjustly treated. It was about showing that power, when wielded recklessly, could be challenged no matter who was on the receiving end, stood unchallenged. But Valerie wasn't about to let it end here. As she stepped into the cool night air, Harrington by her side, she allowed herself a small smile. The officers didn't know it yet, but their actions had set something much larger in motion. This wasn't just about the humiliation of a single evening. It was about exposing a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. But even as she walked away from the station, a sense of quiet determination settled in her chest. The real fight was just beginning. Back at the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. The officers entered, their shoulders squared, their confidence restored by the knowledge that they had acted with impunity. But as they passed through the doors, they were unaware that the repercussions of their actions were already beginning to ripple outwards, gathering momentum. Valerie wasn't going to let this fade into nothing. This wasn't just about her release. This was a battle for justice, and she wasn't going to stop until it was fought in full. The disciplinary hearing loomed ahead, but Officer Reynolds and Officer Daniels walked side by side, their posture stiff and upright, their faces smug with misplaced confidence. They exchanged quick glances, clearly unconcerned about the outcome. After all, they had their defense prepared. In their eyes, she was nothing more than a driver acting suspiciously, and that was the narrative they'd stick to, no more, no less. The courtroom itself was modest, with polished wood paneling that reflected the quiet buzz of anticipation. Rows of seats filled with spectators, all drawn by the tension of what was to come. But to the officers, it was just another room in the justice system, a place where people like them always seemed to hold the upper hand, where they could rely on the assumption that power, once established, was almost always unchallenged. But they were wrong. Valerie knew better. This wasn't just another room, and this wouldn't be just another case. But as they approached the front of the room, something shifted in the air. A murmur swept through the crowd, the kind of subtle change in energy that made people sit a little straighter, their attention drawn toward the source of the shift. The moment hung for a beat, and then the bailiff called out, "All rise." Reynolds and Daniels stood up, their postures stiff and respectful, hands clasped in front of them, their eyes fixed on the empty bench as they waited for the judge to enter. They were still oblivious, still sure they were untouchable, convinced that their defense would be enough to hold them above any real scrutiny. But then the doors to the chambers opened, and there, in the doorway, stood Judge Valerie Chambers. Her black robe billowed slightly as she ascended to the bench, her presence commanding the room like a force of nature. Reynolds and Daniels froze, their faces, once so smug, now drained of color. They watched, unable to look away, as Valerie took her seat. The smugness, the arrogance, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by something they hadn't expected: the unmistakable weight of accountability. Ashen Daniels blinked, as if struggling to reconcile the image of the woman they'd handcuffed days earlier with the stern authority figure now sitting before them. His mind scrambled, unable to process how someone they'd once seen as just another suspicious driver had transformed into the very embodiment of justice in that moment. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. He glanced at his partner, but neither spoke. There was nothing to say. Valerie took her seat, her expression unreadable, her movements deliberate, as if every gesture had purpose. She surveyed the room briefly, her gaze steady, taking in the faces of those present, witnesses, spectators, officers. Her presence alone seemed to fill the room. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but authoritative, slicing through the silence like a sharp blade. "This court is now in session. We are here to address allegations of misconduct by officers Reynolds and Daniels." Her words echoed in the room, each one carrying the weight of what was to come. For the first time since the arrest, Valerie felt a glimmer of justice, an undeniable shift in the balance of power. This was her domain, and now the truth would be heard. Witness statements. Every word was deliberate, every fact undeniable. The room hung on to Avery's every sentence as she laid out the sequence of events with precision, exposing the blatant misuse of power. Valerie remained still, her expression unreadable, but inside she felt the weight of this moment pressing against her chest. This wasn't just about her experience. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or dehumanized under the guise of routine policing. As the footage played, the tension in the room thickened. The grainy video showed it all. Daniels's condescending tone, Reynolds's smirk, the unnecessary aggression, the disregard for her credentials. The arrogance that had dripped from their voices was now a matter of public record. For the first time, Reynolds and Daniels looked shaken. Their earlier confidence had been chipped away, replaced by the cold realization that their actions were no longer theirs to control. When the footage ended, Avery turned toward them, her voice razor sharp. "Officers, do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Silence. Valerie watched them closely, waiting, but she already knew the answer. There was no justification, no excuse that could erase what had been done. The truth had spoken for itself. "Officers Reynolds and Daniels," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "this is not just about what happened to me. This is about a culture, a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored." The room was silent, every eye locked on her. "That night you dismissed my words, ignored my credentials, and treated me with blatant disregard. Not because I was a threat, not because I had done anything wrong, but because you assumed your authority was unquestionable, that no one would challenge your version of events." She let the weight of her words settle. Reynolds swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the table. Daniel's grip on the edge of his seat tightened, his knuckles turning white. "But power is not a shield against accountability," Valerie continued. "And the law, the very law you swore to uphold, is not a weapon to be used at your discretion." She glanced around the courtroom, her gaze sweeping over the faces of those watching. Some were nodding, others sat frozen in quiet disbelief, but all were listening. "You see," she said, leaning slightly forward, "this isn't just about me. It's about the people who don't have a title to invoke, who don't have a platform to speak from, who have been mistreated, ignored, and left without justice. If this can happen to me, imagine what happens to them." A murmur of agreement rippled through the spectators. Valerie exhaled slowly, then straightened. "The truth is in the footage. The truth is in the testimony. And today the truth will not be ignored." She placed her glasses on the table, her message clear. The hearing wasn't just a formality. It was a reckoning. As Valerie's words bore down on them, unrelenting in their truth. "You didn't just violate procedure," she continued, her voice unwavering. "You violated the very foundation upon which justice stands. You made assumptions instead of assessments. You dismissed instead of listened. And worst of all, you wielded your authority not to protect but to intimidate." Reynolds clenched his jaw, his eyes darting toward the screen where the paused footage still displayed their actions in glaring detail. Daniel's posture stiffened, but his usual bravado was gone. Valerie leaned forward slightly, ensuring her next words left no room for misinterpretation. "What happened to me that night should never have happened. To anyone, not to a judge, not to a teacher, not to a mother driving home after a long day, not to a teenager walking home with their hood up. No one." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. The weight of her words pressed down on everyone present, a stark reminder of the deeper issues at play. "The badge you wear is not a license to act without consequence," she said. "It is a responsibility. And when that responsibility is abused, it is not just an individual who suffers. It is the integrity of our entire system." She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough. Then she straightened, her gaze never wavering. "This hearing will determine the consequences of your actions," Valerie said finally, her voice calm yet firm. "But make no mistake, accountability is not optional. Not for you, not for anyone." The officers shifted again, but they had no words left. The evidence had spoken, the truth had been laid bare, and for the first time since that fateful night, they understood they were no longer in control of the narrative and just enforcement of the law. Her voice remained steady, not rising in anger, not wavering in uncertainty, just firm, resolute, the kind of voice that made people listen. "The moment you chose to ignore my words, to escalate without cause, you weren't acting out of caution," Valerie continued, her gaze locked on the officers. "You were acting out of bias, and that bias led to an abuse of power." The defense attorney shifted in his seat, clearly realizing that whatever strategy he had walked in with was crumbling beneath the weight of undeniable truth. Valerie let the silence stretch for a moment before she continued. "You see, officers, I was never a threat to you that night, but you were a threat to justice, and that is what we are here to correct." The impact of her words rippled through the courtroom. This was no longer just about a single traffic stop. It was about something much larger. "As public servants, we do not have the luxury of acting on prejudice," she said, her tone unwavering. "We are held to a higher standard because the trust of the people demands it. And when that trust is broken, it is not simply a mistake, it is a failure that cannot be ignored." Daniel swallowed hard. Reynolds' smirk was long gone. The weight of accountability had finally begun to settle in. Of silent agreement from the spectators in the courtroom, a quiet acknowledgement of the gravity of her words. The officers sat motionless, no longer confident, no longer dismissive. Valerie's presence alone had turned the tide, and now it was time for the consequences. "In my courtroom," she continued, her voice cutting through the stillness, "justice is not a privilege reserved for a few. It is a right. And it is my duty to uphold it without bias, without exception." Her gaze swept over the room, steady, unyielding. She wasn't delivering a verdict driven by emotion or vengeance, but by the principle of what was right. "And as for Officers Reynolds and Daniels," she said, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air, "their actions that night will be met with the accountability they deserve. But more than that, their actions serve as a reminder that our justice system is not infallible, and it is not immune to the need for reform." The officers shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. There would be no escape, no soft landing. Valerie's words were clear. The system itself had failed, and now it would be tested. "I will be recommending suspension and mandatory retraining in community relations and bias awareness," Valerie continued. "But beyond that, this case is a stark reminder that we must all do better. Officers must act with integrity, and those who wield power must always remember that their authority is not limitless." As the debate over the vaccine took place, the room was still. "It is my hope," she concluded, "that this decision will not only hold these officers accountable, but also serve as a catalyst for change. For every person who has been marginalized, dismissed, or wronged by the very system designed to protect them." With that, she looked at the officers one last time, her gaze unwavering. The finality of her words hung in the air. Justice must prevail, not just for the few, but for all. As Valerie left the bench, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the weight of the ruling settling in. It wasn't just a victory for one person. It was a victory for all who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. And with that, the call for real change had been made. They didn't need words. Harrington's quiet support was enough. Valerie's posture softened, but only slightly. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. There was still so much left to do, but for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, a quiet acknowledgement that they had made it through this first battle together. Valerie's footsteps echoed in the corridor, each step reaffirming her resolve. There was a hum in the air, something she could feel stirring in the people who had witnessed the proceedings, something that told her, despite the pain and struggle, the wheels of change had started turning. Her thoughts flickered to her daughter, still fresh in her mind, the graduation speech she still had to write and the promise she'd made to herself to slow down. But she couldn't afford to just slow down, not now, not with everything at stake. As she exited the courthouse and stepped out into the cool evening air, the city felt different somehow. There was a tangible energy, a pulse that she hadn't noticed before. Was it change? Or just the collective breath of everyone holding on, waiting for what would come next? Valerie knew that the path ahead would be difficult. The fight wasn't over, and the systems that needed reform were deep and entrenched. But for today, at least, she had carved out a space for justice, and tomorrow she would continue to build on it. With a final glance back at the courthouse doors, Valerie Chambers knew one thing with certainty. The fight for true justice wasn't a battle for one person or one case. It was a battle for everyone who had been overlooked, for every system that had failed, and she would be there, fighting for all of them. Every step of the way, the platform or the opportunity to seek justice, those who had been silenced or overlooked simply because of who they were. The weight of their story sat heavily on her heart, reminding her that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger, deeper issue. Valerie gave Linda a nod of acknowledgement, her smile fleeting. "It wasn't about grace," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with the exhaustion that was slowly beginning to creep in. It was about making sure their voices were heard. Linda watched her, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She knew that Valerie wasn't just talking about this case. She was talking about the bigger picture, the one that had been ignored for too long. "I know," Linda replied softly. "And you did it. You gave them that chance." Valerie took a deep breath, her gaze turning inward for a moment. The courthouse felt quieter now, empty almost, as if it too had absorbed the gravity of the day. She had held the line today, but the real work, the hard work, was still ahead of her. She turned to face Linda fully. "The system's not broken, Linda," Valerie said, the words sharp yet purposeful. "It's just been working for some and against others. We've got to fix that. And it's going to take more than just a ruling. It's going to take a movement." Linda nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of Valerie's words. "And you're going to lead it?" Valerie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared out the window of her chambers, watching the sun begin to set over the city. The sky was streaked with hues of orange and purple, a reminder that even in the most difficult of times, there was always the possibility of change. The path forward wasn't going to be easy, and she knew there would be many more battles to fight. But Valerie Chambers was ready to confront the system, to hold those in power accountable, and to make sure that justice wasn't just a word, but a promise for everyone. With a final glance at Linda, she turned back to her desk, the quiet weight of the day settling in around her like a shield. The fight for justice had only just begun. But you stayed calm. You didn't let them take control of the situation." Valerie sighed, letting the warmth of the tea settle in her hands. The day had been long, but it was far from over. "You're right," Valerie said, looking up at her daughter with a small, weary smile. "I wanted to be angry, Elena. I wanted to scream, to lash out. But that wouldn't have solved anything. It's not just about the moment. It's about the bigger picture." Elena's brow furrowed as she processed her mother's words. "It's about more than just you, isn't it? You've always said that. It's about the people who don't get the chance to stand up for themselves, who don't have the platform or the voice to fight back." Valerie nodded, taking another slow sip of her tea. "Exactly. That's why I had to keep my composure. I had to make sure they saw beyond their own biases, their own assumptions. Because when people are dismissed, when they're treated like they don't matter, it's not just an insult to them, it's an insult to the very idea of justice. Elena leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. I can't imagine how hard that must have been, but I think that's why you're so good at what you do. You don't just fight for justice. You fight for the people who can't fight for themselves. Valerie felt a lump form in her throat. She was proud of her daughter, proud of how much she understood, how much she'd grown, but she knew there was still so much left to teach her. The road ahead was long, and it would take more than just one case to change things. It's not easy, Valerie said softly, and it's not always clear how things will turn out. Mother and daughter, teacher and student. There's going to be a whole lot of that, but I hope that by doing the right thing, I can help make sure that the people who come after us, people like you, people like your friends, don't have to fight these same battles. Elena reached across the table, her hand warm against her mother's. You're already changing things, Mom. You're already making a difference. Valerie looked at her daughter, her heart full. The journey ahead was daunting, but with Elena by her side, she knew she wasn't fighting alone. There was hope in every step they took together. Thanks, kiddo, Valerie whispered, squeezing her hand. That's all I can ask for. As they sat in the quiet of the kitchen, the weight of the day lightened a little. There was still so much work ahead, but for now, there was peace. Peace in knowing that the fight for justice was far from over, and that she had a reason to keep going, to keep pushing for change. Speak at a local event about justice and accountability. We saw what happened, the voice on the other end said, and we think you're exactly what this community needs. Valerie paused, feeling the weight of the moment. Thank you, she said finally. I'd be honored. As she hung up, she looked out the window, her mind already racing with what came next. No matter what, the fight for justice was far from over, but at least now people were starting to listen, experience the flaws in the system firsthand. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge, she began, her voice steady but filled with purpose. It's not about placing blame, it's about understanding each other, building trust, and ensuring fairness for everyone, no matter their background. She spoke candidly about her arrest, the assumptions made, and the importance of accountability on all sides. As she talked, the room grew quieter, more engaged. Valerie knew it wouldn't be easy, but every conversation, every step forward was one closer to real change. By the end of the forum, there was a palpable shift in the room, a recognition that the path to justice was a collective one, requiring understanding, openness, and a willingness to do better. It wasn't the end of her fight, but it was a start. Wisely, it's not just about enforcing the law, it's about respecting the people you serve. The officer nodded, a newfound resolve in his eyes. Valerie could see the shift in him, a small but significant moment of clarity. She knew this wasn't a one-time conversation, but the beginning of a ripple effect. Change wouldn't come overnight, but every person who left that room with a little more understanding was a step forward. As she walked off the stage, Valerie felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about making her own voice heard. It was about helping others find theirs, and together they could begin to reshape the narrative. Need to hear it. The fight for justice doesn't end with one case, one conversation, or one ruling. It's a continuous effort, a commitment to fairness, empathy, and respect for everyone. As Valerie stepped into her car, she felt ready for whatever came next. The work was far from over, but for the first time in a while, she was confident that the world was, slowly but surely, moving in the right direction. And that, she thought as she drove home, was a victory in itself. As we keep pushing for a fairer, more just society, let's keep having these conversations, learning from each other, and making sure no one is ever overlooked or dismissed. Together we can create a world where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality for everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story to keep the momentum going. Stay tuned for more stories that challenge us to grow, to reflect, and to act. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right.